Everyone believed the billionaire's son would never move again. Doctors confirmed it. Specialists signed their reports. And even his own father stopped hoping. For 2 years, the mansion stayed silent until a new maid arrived. She wasn't a doctor. She wasn't a miracle worker. But what she discovered late one night inside that cold, lifeless room changed everything. A boy once paralyzed began to move when no one was watching, and the truth behind it would shock everyone. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. We love to know that. After the accident that killed his wife, Richard Hayes shut himself off from the world. He stopped visiting the company he had built. He stopped answering calls from friends. The world saw him as a man of power, but behind the iron gates of the Hayes estate, he was just a father watching his child drift further into silence. 6-year-old Liam Hayes had survived the crash, but the doctors said his spine was irreparably damaged, paralyzed from the neck down. No chance of recovery, they had said, their words cold, factual, merciless. Since that day, Liam had not spoken. He lay still in his bed, eyes half open, watching the same ceiling day after day. Machines hummed softly beside him. A monitor blinked. The air smelled faintly of antiseptic and loss. Richard visited his son's room every morning, always the same way, silent, rigid, emotionless. He adjusted the blanket, brushed the boy's hair gently back, and whispered words he didn't expect anyone to hear. "I'm sorry, Liam. I should have been there." But Liam never responded. He blinked slowly, his eyes vacant but alive, trapped inside a body that refused to move. The mansion had once been filled with laughter. Now, every step Richard took echoed through its marble halls like a memory refusing to fade. The servants walked quietly, afraid of breaking the fragile calm. Only Mr. Alden Pierce, the butler, moved with confidence, following schedules, maintaining routines, never asking questions. Every week, doctors came and went. They checked machines, changed medications, and left new instructions. None of it made a difference. Then one morning, Richard decided to hire new staff. Not for his company, but for his home. Someone to manage daily care. Not a nurse, but someone who could stay by Liam's side full-time. That's when Grace Miller arrived. She came from far away, quiet town, simpler life. Her resume was modest. Housekeeping, childcare, nothing extraordinary. But her eyes carried something the others didn't. Empathy that couldn't be faked. Richard didn't notice it at first. He barely looked up during her interview. He only said, "The child doesn't speak, doesn't move. Just make sure he's comfortable." Grace nodded silently, understanding more than she said. She had lost a child once too. A little boy, only 6, taken by illness before she could say goodbye. Since then, she had lived quietly, working in places where people didn't ask about her past. The Hayes estate was unlike anywhere she'd ever been. The halls were too wide, too cold. The air carried the kind of silence that doesn't rest, the silence of grief trying to hide behind luxury. When she first entered Liam's room, she froze. There he was, a boy far too young to look that still. His body rested under white sheets, his head tilted slightly toward the window, his small chest rising and falling with shallow rhythm. A soft beeping filled the air. Grace walked closer, adjusting the light streaming through the curtains. For a moment, she thought she saw his eyelids flutter. Just a fraction. But she brushed it off. She set to work quietly, folding clothes, cleaning corners, adjusting monitors under the supervision of the household nurse. Her movements were gentle, almost reverent. Days passed, and she began to notice patterns. Every afternoon, precisely at 2 p.m., Mr. Pierce entered with a small syringe. He never spoke. He would simply inject a clear fluid into the IV line, check the monitor, and leave. When Grace once asked, "What's that for?" he answered flatly, "Muscle stability." Doctor's orders. But she couldn't help noticing what happened afterward. Every time the injection was given, Liam's breathing slowed, his eyes dulled, and the faint tension in his fingers disappeared. It was as if the medicine didn't just numb his body, it silenced it completely. That night, she couldn't sleep. Lying in her small room down the hall, she listened to the faint hum of machines from Liam's room. Tick, tick, tick. The sound was steady, but it felt wrong. Too steady, too lifeless. She remembered her own son. The way she used to watch his chest rise and fall at night. The way silence had followed when it stopped. Tears gathered in her eyes, but she wiped them quickly away. This wasn't her child. This wasn't her pain to feel. Still, something inside her whispered, "Look closer." The next morning, she entered early, before anyone else. The sun was barely rising, painting the room gold. She leaned close, studying Liam's face. His skin was pale but warm. His lashes fluttered faintly in sleep. And then she noticed it again, a twitch. So small it could have been imagined. The slightest movement in one finger, Grace's heart skipped. She held her breath, but then it stopped. He was still again. She told herself it was nothing. A nerve reflex, maybe. But something inside her refused to let it go. She whispered softly, "If you can hear me, Liam, move again." Nothing. The room stayed quiet. But Grace didn't leave. She sat by his bedside, waiting, whispering small things, stories, prayers, words that didn't need answers. And somewhere deep inside, though she couldn't see it yet, something in Liam's mind began to stir. That night, long after everyone had gone to sleep, the cameras in the hall caught something unusual. A faint sound, a creak of movement from the room that had been still for months. And then, the soft sound of something falling. By morning, no one believed it. Not yet, but Grace would soon, because she was the only one who cared enough to keep watching when everyone else had stopped. Grace Miller carried her past like a small stone in her pocket, heavy, private, always there under the surface. She had not planned to stay in one place for long. After losing her little boy, she had bounced between jobs, sleeping in spare rooms, letting work keep her hands busy so her heart would slow. The world had become a series of routines, tidy, clean, quiet. No questions, no expectations. When the Hayes estate offered her the position, she accepted because the job description was simple. Live-in household help. Assist with daily care for the child. Maintain cleanliness. There were no interviews about grief or healing. There were no awkward condolences. It suited her. She could work and breathe the same thin air everyone else pretended ignored the absence at the center of the house. Her first days were practical. She learned the layout of the mansion, where linens were stored, the names of cleaning supplies, the schedule that kept the staff moving like a clock. Mr. Alden Pierce walked past her with a measured step, and the nurses gave curt nods. Richard was rare in public. He spoke only to the house administrator and to the doctors. Grace kept to tasks. She kept to silence. But silence is porous. Sounds slip through, the hum of a hospital monitor beneath a pillow, the low rustle of a blanket when the night nurse adjusts a limb, the soft, tiny breath of a 6-year-old boy who remembers sunlight only in flashes. Liam was 6 years old, small hands, hair that curled at the nape, a face that seemed too young for such patient stillness. When Grace first saw him, she felt the familiar stab of memory, the echo of her own son's round cheeks, the small laugh she missed every day. She learned the physical map of his body quickly, the way machines attached to him, the bandages that never fully faded, the stiff limbs that required frequent positioning. The nurse showed her where to lift, where to support, how to change a dressing. "He's comfortable," the nurse would say. "He's stable." The words were like a script anyone could recite. They were not the truth Grace felt in the room. Her nights were the hardest. The mansion closed its doors at 10. Lights were dimmed. The staff retreated to their quarters. Grace would set a cup of tea on the small table in her room and sit lengthening into the quiet until it felt like sleep might come. But sleep was thin. Her mind drifted back to a simpler rhythm, the buoyant energy of a child, the tiny feet, the way a hand fits into yours. She would breathe, count her memories, and try to bargain with fate in the hush of the old house. It was during one of those nights that she first heard the sound, a noise so small it might have been imagined. Around 2 in the morning, something like a soft scuff, a whisper of movement from the room at the end of the hall. It was not a machine. Machines had a predictable cadence. This was something else, an uncertain scrape, like the brush of fabric across wood. Grace dressed quietly and walked the corridor barefoot, each step prayerful. She paused at Liam's door and peered in. The lamp in the corner cast a narrow pool of light. Liam lay on his back, chest moving in sleep. Machines blinked green. And then, toward the foot of the bed, a shadow shifted. Slight, human, she froze. Her heart punched against her ribs. For a moment she thought she was seeing ghosts or sleep-trick. Then she realized a soft ripple in the blanket near his ankle, a tremor. The sheet had been dragged, almost imperceptibly, 1/2 inch. She held her breath. Nothing more. No sound, no motion. She waited until her eyes adjusted, until the night air tasted like alarm and longing. But the room returned to its stillness. Had she imagined it? Was it the house playing with her grief? The next day she asked herself if she should tell someone. Nurses would dismiss a night's imagined shift as the mind's attempt to fill silences. The butler would say, "The child is stable." And Richard, she could not imagine telling him. His face already carried the weight of a man who had given up asking for miracles. So she began to watch. Not in a clinical way, more like someone who waits for a note of a song she once loved. She watched the rhythms of the day, the times injections were given, the way monitors dimmed and brightened, the precise movements Mr. Pierce made as he fulfilled orders. She noted small things others accepted, the way a certain nurse always left before midnight, the way specific lights were off during the night, the exact moments when the staff's footfalls sounded lighter. And then she discovered cameras, little eyes painted on the corners of the room, inconspicuous until you looked up and saw their glass faces glinting. The estate kept watch even in stillness. Grace requested access quietly, explaining her need to ensure she performed her duties correctly. Permissions were granted with the bureaucratic efficiency of people who did not expect anything unusual. That night, she sat in a darkened monitoring room, an old coffee cooling beside her, and she pressed play on the recorded footage from 2 in the morning. The screen showed Liam, pale and still, machines humming. The camera's night vision made the scene ghostly, soft whites and grays. She leaned forward, every inch of her alert. Time ticked forward on the monitor. Then, at 2:14 a.m., the image shivered. The sheet at Liam's feet moved. A finger twitched. A hand, once rigid, flexed faintly. Grace's breath stuck. She played it again, slow motion. There it was, a sequence of small motions, a shoulder lift, a slow turning of the head, movements so slight they had escaped weeks of daytime observation. But they existed. Her hands shook. She felt an uprising of hope and fear. If Liam moved at night, why had the staff never told anyone? Why had doctors not noticed? Why did the reports speak only of permanence and acceptance? She scrolled further through the footage. At 3:02 a.m., the camera caught more. Liam's eyelids fluttered. He turned his face toward the darkness. He seemed to stretch, not with the mechanical jerk of a reflex, but with intention. His fingers grazed the blanket. For a heartbeat, the smallest, quietest heartbeat, he reached. Grace scrubbed her face with both hands. Images of her own boy flickered across her mind, reaching in the dark, reaching for a small hand. She felt old grief and new determination knit together. She did not tell anyone that night. To speak too soon would risk being dismissed as a grieving woman seeing what she wished to see. Instead, she printed the frames, noted the times, and returned the footage to its folder as if she were leaving a treasure in a safe place. She decided to watch more nights, to collect evidence, to learn whether this breath of motion was real or simply the product of lonely hope. For the first week, the nights were indecisive. Some nights Liam shifted, Some nights he did not. The pattern seemed uneven, but patterns often began that way. A tremor here, a blink there, a hand that curled and uncurling like a small rebellion against immobility. Grace changed the way she worked. She adjusted his pillows in the day with gentler hands. She played recordings of quiet humming near his bed. She left small tokens within reach, toys with bright colors, a small mirror turned at an angle, a soft blanket he once had. She learned the exact moment the injections were given, and she watched how, after the medicine, his motions slowed. When the drug's effect seemed least, his body responded. She began to suspect a cruel possibility. Perhaps Liam was not immobile all the time. Perhaps he could move when not dulled by something in his system. The thought was a terror and a promise at once. The mansion, for now, pretended normality. But Grace's nights were changing. In the dark, she had become a witness. And witnesses by nature are the beginning of truth. Grace woke each morning now with the same question circling her mind. What did I really see? Some days she convinced herself she had imagined it, that exhaustion or grief had blurred her senses. But every night the recordings said otherwise. Tiny motions, small rebellions of muscle and will. A boy who was supposed to be paralyzed, moving in the dark when no one watched. She kept her secret close, written in neat ink across folded notebook pages. Date, time, movement, medicine. Each entry a heartbeat in a growing pattern. The mansion, meanwhile, existed in its own rhythm. Breakfast served precisely at 8. Mr. Pierce crossing the halls at 9. Deliveries at 10. Richard Hayes descending the staircase at 11, suited, expression carved from stone. He would stop by the large dining room window, look out over the bay, and then retreat to his study without a word. He was a man of precision, and precision had become his shield. Every moment controlled, every emotion locked behind routine. But behind his eyes, exhaustion had built into something heavier, guilt. Grace would sometimes see him standing at Liam's door late at night, his hand hovering over the frame, but never pushing it open. He would stand there for minutes, breathing quietly, as if watching through the door could substitute for touching the child within. And then he would walk away, footsteps fading into the marble silence. It wasn't that he didn't love his son. It was that he couldn't bear the shape that love had taken, silent, helpless, and full of what-ifs. But the house was changing. Grace felt it. The silence wasn't absolute anymore. She could hear it, the hum of machines, the faint rhythm of Liam's breathing, and sometimes at the edge of hearing, the soft creak of bedsheets when no one else was near. One afternoon, as she was dusting the corridor near Liam's room, she heard a soft sound like a small sigh. She froze. The nurse had left an hour earlier. The boy was alone. Grace put down the duster and stepped closer to the door. The sigh came again, faint but real. She turned the handle slowly and peered in. The curtain fluttered gently from the breeze of an open window. Sunlight spilled across the bed. Liam's face was turned toward the light. And then, for the briefest second, one of his toes twitched under the blanket. Grace gasped quietly, pressing her hand to her mouth. The motion stopped immediately, as though even the air had startled him. She stepped back, heart hammering. Her instinct said to call someone, but another voice, deeper, calmer, said, "Not yet. Watch." That evening she made a small change. When she brought in the dinner tray for Richard, she left his plate by the door and spoke softly. "Sir, I've noticed the boy's window is open most afternoons. The breeze might chill him." Richard looked up from his paperwork briefly, the first eye contact they'd shared in days. "Leave it," he said flatly. He used to like the wind. It reminded him of the garden. "Let it in." Grace nodded quietly, stepping away. She realized then that even in detachment, Richard still reached for traces of his son's past, memories hidden in small allowances. That night, the footage showed something extraordinary. At 2:08 a.m., Liam's hand moved. Not a twitch this time, but a deliberate curl of fingers, slow and unsteady. His arm lifted an inch off the bed before dropping again. Grace replayed it over and over. Each time her tears blurred the screen. She began timing the events against the medicine schedule. The pattern was unmistakable. 3 to 4 hours after Mr. Pierce administered the evening injection, the child began to stir. The longer the gap between doses, the more motion appeared. Something in the medication was suppressing his movement. Not paralysis. Control. Grace's thoughts raced through the night. She needed evidence strong enough to break through disbelief. For that, she would need the father. The next morning, Richard emerged from his study earlier than usual. He looked tired, his tie loosened, the polished calm slipping. Grace saw him in the hallway and stepped forward before fear could change her mind. "Mr. Hayes," she said softly. He stopped, waiting. I think there's something you should see," she said. "About Liam," he frowned. "Is something wrong?" "No, or maybe yes. I'm not sure yet, but I think he moves at night." The words hung in the air like something blasphemous. Richard blinked, confusion shifting to impatience. "Miss Miller, I appreciate your concern, but my son's condition has been thoroughly examined. Reflexive spasms may appear. That's not movement, it's residue, nothing more." Grace hesitated, then met his eyes steadily. "I've been watching the recordings. I've seen it happen. It's not random. He moves with purpose." Richard's jaw tightened. "You watch the cameras?" "Yes, sir. I needed to understand how he rests. Please just look at the footage once. If I'm wrong, I'll never bring it up again." For a moment he said nothing, then quietly, "Bring it to me tonight." Grace spent the day nervous, replaying the clips, organizing timestamps. The household moved around her, unaware that something monumental was quietly assembling beneath their ordinary routines. That evening, after dinner, she carried a small drive to Richard's study. He gestured toward the large screen on the wall. "Show me." The first few minutes passed in silence. The camera showed the usual stillness, machines blinking, faint shadows. Then the motion began, the lift of a hand, the turn of a face. Richard leaned forward slowly, elbows on his knees. His eyes widened. Grace paused the video, then played it again in slow motion. "He does this every few nights," she whispered. "Always between 2 and 3. Always when the last injection is wearing off." Richard sat back, stunned. "Why didn't anyone? How is this possible?" "I don't know. But if the medicine keeps him still, maybe it's not healing him. Maybe it's stopping him from trying." Richard stood abruptly, walking to the window, rubbing his temples. The city lights blinked faintly below the hill. "You're suggesting they've been drugging him into stillness?" Grace's voice shook but stayed firm. "I'm suggesting there's more to his condition than they've told you, and that he's trying to reach out." He turned, eyes wet with disbelief. "Trying to reach what?" "Maybe you," she said softly. The words landed with quiet force. For the first time, Richard's composure cracked. He sat down heavily, covering his face with one hand. The man who had built empires could not build a wall high enough to keep this truth out. After a long pause, he whispered, "If what you're saying is real, then I've failed him again." Grace shook her head. "No, sir. You can still save him." That night, for the first time since the accident, Richard walked to his son's room and stayed there for hours, watching, waiting, hoping for movement he could not yet see. And somewhere between the soft mechanical breaths and the hum of machines, the boy stirred again. It was small, but real, a hand shifting toward the faint glow of the window. And this time Richard saw it too. That night, Richard Hayes did not sleep. He sat in the dark corner of his son's room, the glow of machines painting faint shadows across his face. For the first time in months, he was not buried behind work or whiskey. He was here, present, waiting. Grace sat on the far side of the room, near the small reading lamp she kept dim. Neither spoke, only the steady rhythm of the heart monitor filled the space between them. Liam lay motionless as always, his face calm, lashes fluttering faintly against his skin. The machines around him pulsed with quiet precision, steady, mechanical, almost too perfect. Midnight came, then 1, still nothing. Grace's eyes burned from staring too long. She whispered softly, "It usually happens closer to 2. Richard nodded, eyes fixed on his son. Minutes crawled by. The air felt heavy, like time itself was holding its breath. And then it happened. At first it was small, a tremor, a ripple beneath the blanket. Richard straightened immediately. Liam's fingers twitched, then curled slowly. His head tilted, barely an inch, but deliberate. His hand lifted, shaking, reaching toward the faint light near the window. Richard's throat closed. His hand instinctively reached forward, but Grace held his arm gently. "Don't move," she whispered. He might stop, so he watched. The man who once negotiated billion-dollar deals sat frozen, afraid to breathe too loudly as his paralyzed son reached again. The small hand trembled mid-air, then dropped softly back to the bed. Grace turned to him. "You see it now?" she whispered. Richard couldn't speak. His eyes glistened with tears he hadn't allowed himself to shed in years. When he finally found his voice, it came out raw. "My God, he's fighting." Grace nodded slowly. "He's been fighting all along." For a moment, the entire mansion felt alive, the still air charged with the electricity of something impossible. Richard rose quietly, walking to his son's bedside. He crouched, his hand hovering just above Liam's cheek. "Liam," his voice broke. "Can you hear me, son?" The boy's eyelids fluttered again, softly, faintly, like the ghost of a response. Grace covered her mouth. Richard leaned closer. It wasn't a coincidence anymore. It wasn't hope pretending to be truth. It was real. When morning came, Richard summoned the in-house nurse and demanded every record of medication, every prescription, every dosage sheet. The nurse hesitated, startled by the sudden urgency. "Sir, all treatment was approved by Dr. Langford. We only followed protocol." "I didn't ask for protocol," Richard snapped. "I asked for the truth." Grace stood silently nearby, her gaze steady. The files arrived by noon. Dozens of reports, prescriptions, and dosage logs, thick bureaucratic paper filled with medical jargon. Richard turned page after page until one caught his eye. Neuroinhibitor dosage. Maintained bidaily. He looked up, frowning. "What the hell is this?" The nurse shifted uncomfortably. "A sedative, sir. To prevent neural overstimulation." Richard slammed the folder shut. "To prevent him from trying, you mean?" When Dr. Marcus Langford arrived later that afternoon for his scheduled check-in, Richard was waiting. He stood by the window, the city's skyline behind him, the folder open on his desk. The doctor entered with his usual calm smile. "Mr. Hayes, I hear there's been some concern." Richard turned slowly. His tone was low but lethal. "You've been drugging my son to keep him still." Langford blinked. "That's a dramatic interpretation. The medication is standard for high-level spinal trauma." He moved. The doctor froze. Grace, standing behind Richard, spoke quietly. "We both saw it. He moves every night, around 2, always when the drug wears off." Langford forced a chuckle, stepping closer. "What you're describing is residual muscular activity, reflexive motion, nothing cognitive." "Believe me, Mr. Hayes, Richard slammed the folder shut again, cutting him off. "I don't believe you anymore." The doctor's smile faltered. "You're making a dangerous assumption." "No," Richard snapped, voice trembling with fury and grief. "You're the one who made assumptions. You took my son's life and turned it into an experiment." The room went quiet. The only sound was the faint hum of the city beyond the glass. Dr. Langford's face stiffened. "If you disrupt treatment, you'll jeopardize what little stability remains. The paralysis will never improve." "Then maybe it's time to test that," Richard said coldly. "Effective immediately. No more of your drugs touch his system." Langford hesitated, then scoffed softly. "You're a businessman, not a physician. You're letting this woman's delusions cloud your judgment." Richard's eyes hardened. "Get out." The doctor stood still, eyes darting between them. Then he picked up his bag and left without another word. After he was gone, silence filled the study again. Richard stood at the window, hands trembling, the weight of what he'd just discovered pressing against his chest. Grace stepped closer. "You did the right thing." His eyes stayed fixed on the horizon. "If you're wrong, I'm not." He turned then, looking at her, the first real look between them since she'd arrived. "Why do you care so much?" Grace hesitated. Her voice came out soft, honest. "Because I lost a son too, and I know what it's like when the world tells you there's nothing left to hope for." That broke him. For the first time since the accident, Richard let the tears come. Silent, fierce cleansing. Grace didn't move. She didn't comfort him. She just stood there, letting him have the one thing he'd denied himself for years: grief. That night, neither of them slept. The injections stopped. The machines continued to hum, and sometime after midnight, Liam stirred again, longer this time, his hand lifted higher, trembling toward the light, as if testing the air. In the faint glow of the bedside lamp, Grace whispered, "He's waking up." Richard nodded slowly, voice breaking through the quiet. "I think he's been awake all along." For the first time in 2 years, the medicine was gone. No syringes, no clear fluid in sterile vials, no numb silence pressed upon a 6-year-old body. The first day without it felt both terrifying and sacred. Grace didn't expect instant change, but something in the air was different. Alive, restless, waiting. Even the machines seemed to hum with anticipation. Richard stayed home that morning, unable to leave the house. His company could wait. This mattered more. He sat by Liam's bed for hours, watching for movement, for a breath that carried intention. At noon, when nothing happened, frustration began to surface. Maybe the doctor was right. Maybe they were chasing illusions. Grace didn't argue. She simply said, "Miracles don't follow our clocks." By evening, the sun dipped below the bay, turning the walls amber. Richard dozed briefly in the chair. Grace read quietly from a book, her voice low, rhythmic, comforting. And then softly, something shifted. The heart monitor ticked one beat faster. Grace looked up, confused. Liam's fingers twitched once, twice, then curled slightly. It wasn't random. It was controlled. "Mr. Hayes," she whispered. Richard woke instantly. His eyes followed her gaze, and then he saw it. Liam's right hand moved again, brushing the edge of the blanket. Slow, heavy, but deliberate. Richard's breath hitched. He's moving." Grace nodded, tears forming. "Yes, he is." Liam's eyes fluttered open. They didn't stare blankly anymore. They searched. He blinked twice, and his lips parted faintly, a whisper too soft to hear. Richard leaned close, voice trembling. "Liam, it's Dad. Can you hear me?" The boy's gaze drifted slowly toward him, his lashes wet with effort. And then, like a spark inside a storm, his lips formed a word. Faint, strained. "Da." Richard froze. The world around him blurred. He hadn't heard that sound since before the accident. He cupped his hand over his mouth, shaking. "Oh, God." Grace's voice broke in a whisper. He said, "Dad." They watched as Liam's eyes fluttered closed again, exhaustion overtaking him. But that one sound, one syllable, was more powerful than any treatment in the world. For the next few days, everything changed. Grace modified the routine. She brought in soft music, sunlight through open curtains, gentle stretches. Liam's small body began responding in ways that shocked everyone. A hand that once lay dead now squeezed faintly. A head that never turned now shifted toward sound. By the third day, Richard couldn't deny it anymore. His son was returning from a prison no one had believed existed. Mr. Alden Pierce, the butler, was the first to notice the father's transformation. The man who once walked through the mansion like a ghost now smiled. He stopped eating alone. He started giving orders with purpose again. But more than anything, he spent hours beside Liam reading stories. talking as if the boy could answer. One evening, after another long day of small miracles, Grace walked into the study and found Richard standing by the window. He didn't turn when he spoke. "You were right," Grace smiled faintly. "He's stronger every day." Richard nodded. "But I keep thinking, what if I'd listened earlier? What if I hadn't trusted that doctor? How many years did I steal from him?" She walked closer. "Don't carry that. You didn't steal his time. You're giving it back now." He looked at her then, really looked. "You talk like someone who's known loss." Grace lowered her eyes. "I have." Her fingers brushed the edge of the table. "I lost my boy 3 years ago, 6 years old, pneumonia. One night he was laughing and the next morning," her voice faltered, "he was gone. I still wait for him sometimes, in dreams." Richard's eyes softened, the anger in him giving way to empathy. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. She nodded, eyes glistening. "It's strange. When I first saw Liam, I thought God was punishing me, making me relive what I'd lost. But maybe he was giving me a chance to save a child I couldn't before." Richard's throat tightened. "You already have." The next morning, Grace arrived early, carrying fresh linens. The first rays of dawn filled the room. Liam was awake, his eyes moving, scanning slowly. She smiled. "Good morning, sunshine." The boy blinked twice as if responding. "Do you know what day it is?" she asked softly, even though she didn't expect an answer. To her surprise, his lips moved. "Day," he whispered faintly. Grace gasped, tears instantly welling. "You're talking. You're really talking." She pressed the call button for Richard, who rushed in moments later, breathless. Liam's small voice filled the room again, broken but real. "Dad." Richard knelt by the bed, his forehead touching his son's hand. "I'm here, buddy." "I'm right here." Grace turned away, covering her mouth, her shoulders shaking. Over the next hours, the house came alive. Nurses whispered in disbelief. Mr. Pierce, who had seen decades of this family's history, stood silently in the doorway, his stoic face cracking into a rare, quiet smile. No one spoke of the doctor anymore. His name became taboo, a ghost exiled from the mansion's walls. What mattered now was the present, the fragile, miraculous return of movement, of voice, of hope. By the end of the week, Liam could move both hands, turn his head toward the window, and form a handful of words. Each sound was a victory, each blink a small resurrection. At night, Richard and Grace often sat in the hallway after checking on him, talking in low voices. "I used to think money could buy anything," Richard confessed once. "But it couldn't buy this." Grace smiled. "No. Some things only come back when they're loved enough." And for the first time, Richard believed her, because in that house once filled with silence, a 6-year-old boy had begun to speak again. And with every word he learned, the mansion itself seemed to breathe. The miracle that filled the Hayes estate with light didn't stay hidden for long. When silence turns to laughter, the world begins to listen. Within a week, the medical staff assigned by Dr. Marcus Langford noticed the changes in Liam's charts: muscle activity, voluntary motion, improved neural response. For 2 years, the reports had been flat lines of despair. Now, every new line climbed upward like a pulse returning to life. But progress can be inconvenient for people who profit from permanence. One morning, while Grace prepared breakfast, she overheard Mr. Pierce on the phone in the hallway. His tone was cautious, almost whispering. "Yes, doctor. The father's aware. Yes, the medication has been stopped." "No, I didn't." He paused suddenly, noticing Grace's reflection in the glass. He turned, mask of politeness snapping into place. "Miss Miller, who were you speaking to?" she asked quietly. He hesitated. "Just confirming deliveries." Grace didn't push further, but she knew. He wasn't confirming deliveries. He was reporting. That evening, she told Richard, "I think Mr. Pierce still talks to Dr. Langford." Richard's eyes darkened. "Why would he?" "Maybe because he's scared," Grace said softly. "Some people serve authority even when it's wrong." Habit becomes loyalty. Richard didn't answer. He simply exhaled deeply and nodded. Then we end the habit. The next morning, when Mr. Pierce entered the study with the day's schedule, Richard was waiting. "Sit down," he said. The butler hesitated, unused to the tone. "Sir?" "Sit." He obeyed quietly. Richard placed a printed copy of the phone log on the desk. "You called Dr. Langford 3 times in the past 2 days. Mr. Pierce blinked slowly. "I was instructed years ago to report updates on the child's condition directly to the doctor." "And who instructed you to keep doing it after I fired him?" "I didn't think his dismissal changed the medical chain of communication." "It did," Richard said coldly. "And if you ever make another call without my consent, you won't be in this house another day." Mr. Pierce's composure cracked for the first time in years. "Yes, sir." When he left, Grace stepped into the study. "Was that wise?" she asked softly. "Yes," Richard said, "because I'm done living in ignorance." Later that day, Richard contacted a trusted physician outside Langford's network, Dr. Isabel Carter, a neurologist known for her honesty and unconventional methods. When she arrived, she carried no entourage, no arrogance, only curiosity and quiet respect. She examined Liam with patient eyes. "What was the official diagnosis?" she asked. "Complete spinal paralysis," Richard said. "And the treatment?" He handed her the file, a stack of prescriptions and medical summaries written in Langford's dense clinical language. Dr. Carter flipped through them, her brow furrowing. "These doses are far too strong. This combination would suppress nearly all motor function. It's like sedating the body into stillness." Grace exchanged a glance with Richard. "So he wasn't paralyzed?" Dr. Carter looked up. "It's hard to say for certain. But if he's already regaining control, it means the nerves were never fully severed. They were suppressed. The medication likely slowed recovery, possibly for years." Richard's hand clenched into a fist. "He stole my son's life." Dr. Carter nodded slowly. "I've seen this before. Some doctors use aggressive inhibitors to maintain control over recovery. It makes progress appear impossible. Families stop asking questions. The doctor keeps his reputation safe from failure." Grace felt sick. So the paralysis wasn't fate. It was management. "Yes," Dr. Carter said quietly, "and very deliberate." Richard stood abruptly, pacing near the window. His voice trembled with fury. He said there was no hope. He said movement was impossible. "Hope," Dr. Carter said gently, "was never gone. It was just hidden under chemicals." The room went still. Outside, the wind pressed against the glass, rattling faintly, as if even the world protested the lie. Dr. Carter spent hours observing Liam. She performed gentle sensory tests, light touches, sound cues, temperature stimuli. Liam responded to nearly everything, not perfectly, but enough to prove beyond doubt that the paralysis had been misrepresented. "He'll need therapy," she said, "but he's young. With time, he'll walk again." Grace felt tears rise, the relief almost painful. Richard's shoulders dropped, the tension of years dissolving in quiet disbelief. "He'll walk?" "Yes," she smiled softly. "Not today, not tomorrow, but someday soon." For the rest of the day, Grace stayed with Liam as Dr. Carter wrote new recovery protocols. The mansion was quieter than usual, but not with grief, with purpose. Every person felt it, the shift from mourning to movement. That night, Richard made a call of his own, not to a doctor, not to a lawyer, but to a journalist he trusted. He didn't mention names, not yet. He only said, "When I have proof, the world will know." Grace found him later, standing in the dim hallway outside Liam's room. He looked at her and said, "You once told me you lost your son." She nodded. "I can't give you back what you lost," he said quietly. "But you gave me back mine." "That has to mean something." Grace smiled faintly, her voice trembling. "It means everything." Behind the glass door, Liam slept peacefully. No machines forcing his rhythm, no injections freezing his body. just a boy, breathing freely, his fingers twitching softly against the blanket, as if dreaming of running again. The next morning, headlines began to whisper what the world would soon scream. Billionaire's son's miracle recovery raises questions about doctors' practices. And while reporters started circling the gates, inside the mansion a father and a maid stood beside a bed, watching the first sunrise that truly felt alive. The gates of the Hayes estate had never been crowded before. Now they glimmered with camera flashes every morning. Cars lined the road outside. Reporters, doctors, legal aides, all hunting for a piece of a story that had outgrown its walls. Billionaire's son. Miracle case questioned. Doctor under fire for false paralysis claim. Every headline spelled scandal. Richard Hayes didn't care about the noise outside. He cared about the silence inside, the kind that came after lies collapse. Dr. Isabel Carter's report was complete now. A detailed document proving that Liam's condition had been misdiagnosed and deliberately maintained with heavy neurosuppressants. It listed each illegal dosage, every ignored recovery sign, and the exact date when treatment should have stopped. Her conclusion was simple, brutal, and final. The patient was never permanently paralyzed. Continued administration of the suppressants prevented neural recovery. Richard read that line until he couldn't see through the tears. He had already filed the complaint with the state medical board. His lawyers prepared civil suits. But this was more than legal vengeance. It was personal absolution. Dr. Marcus Langford responded through his attorney with arrogance. All care administered was within medical discretion, his statement read. Any perceived malpractice is the result of patient interference and unauthorized caretaking by unqualified staff. He meant Grace. When Richard saw the statement, anger burned through him. "He's blaming her," he said, his voice shaking. Grace stood quietly by the fireplace, reading the words herself. "It's all right," she said softly. "Truth doesn't need permission." But Richard didn't calm easily. He had been patient once. Not anymore. He met with his lawyer the next morning. "I want every file unsealed. I want the press to have it." The lawyer hesitated. "That could get messy." "Public trials? Then let it get messy," Richard said coldly. "My son lived 2 years in silence because of a lie. The world should know what that looks like." By the end of the week, the story exploded nationwide. TV hosts debated ethics. Online forums demanded punishment. Dr. Langford disappeared from his clinic. And while the city tore itself apart with speculation, the mansion grew strangely peaceful. Inside, progress replaced panic. Liam could now move both hands. His voice was still faint, but his words grew clearer each day. "Dad, Grace, light." Each syllable was a small victory carved out of pain. Every evening, Grace and Richard took him out to the balcony wrapped in a soft blanket. The wind that once passed through cold corridors now brushed against a boy's smiling face. Sometimes, when Liam slept, Richard confessed his guilt in whispers. "I kept believing the wrong people," he said. "I thought money made truth reliable." Grace would smile sadly. "Money buys comfort. Truth needs courage." He looked at her once and said, "Then I was a coward." "No," she replied. "You were a father who didn't know he was allowed to hope." They fell into a rhythm, quiet, steady, necessary. Grace oversaw therapy sessions under Dr. Carter's guidance. Richard managed the legal storm outside. Both found purpose again in caring for the boy who was learning how to exist beyond stillness. But truth, once set free, rarely travels gently. One evening, while Grace was preparing Liam for bed, Mr. Pierce appeared at the doorway, his usual formality gone. His face was pale. "There's a man downstairs," he said quietly. "Says he's from the press." "He's asking for you, Miss Miller." Grace froze. "For me?" "Yes." She went downstairs reluctantly. A reporter stood in the foyer, holding a microphone lowered to his side. "Miss Miller, I only need a comment. You were the one who discovered the boy's movement, correct?" She nodded once, uncertain. Did you act alone?" he asked. "Or did the father instruct you to spy on medical procedures?" The question stung. "I didn't spy," she said firmly. "I watched because no one else would. Do you think your actions endangered the child?" Her hands clenched. "No, they saved him." The reporter smiled tightly. "That's all, ma'am." He left without another word. The next morning, the headline appeared, "Maid accused of tampering with medical equipment in miracle case." Richard stormed into the kitchen, the paper crumpled in his hand. "They're turning you into the villain." Grace shrugged softly. "That's what happens when truth hurts power." He exhaled, voice breaking. "I won't let them ruin you for saving my son." Grace smiled faintly. "You already did that part, Mr. Hayes. You stood up. You believed me." Outside, storms of gossip raged. Inside, small miracles continued. Dr. Carter arrived daily, ignoring the cameras and questions. Liam's progress astonished her. She filmed every motion for medical record, every lift of the hand, every attempt to sit, every syllable formed from lips that had forgotten speech. "This isn't recovery," she told Richard one evening. "It's resurrection." Meanwhile, legal pressure crushed Dr. Langford's empire. Former patients came forward, whispering stories of suppressed movement, unexplained medications, hopeless diagnoses that matched Liam's. A class action began. Richard didn't care for lawsuits or settlements. He wanted something else, a confession, and he got it. 2 weeks later, Langford was arrested after a former assistant leaked internal memos. "Maintain treatment. Keep the father compliant. The child's motor activity is minimal and manageable with dosage control." Manageable, Richard repeated bitterly when he read it. "He managed my son like a machine." That night he sat beside Liam's bed holding his hand. "You're free now," he whispered. "No one will ever silence you again." The boy's small fingers curled around his father's hand. For the first time, Richard didn't cry. He smiled, and in that fragile stillness, Grace stood by the door, her eyes full. She knew that the story was far from over. Justice would be loud, healing would be quiet. But for the first time since she lost her own child, she wasn't haunted by what she couldn't save. She was part of what she could. The world had already decided the Hayes story was a miracle. For journalists, it was a headline. For doctors, a debate. But for Richard, Grace, and 6-year-old Liam, it was a beginning. Weeks passed quietly after the storm. Reporters drifted away. The gates stayed closed. Inside, life found its rhythm again, not in grandeur but in small things. Mornings began with laughter. Grace would draw open the curtains, letting sunlight fall across Liam's bed. "Good morning, soldier," she'd say playfully. Liam, still shy with words, would grin faintly and reply, "Morning, Grace." Every syllable was deliberate, each one a small triumph. Dr. Carter's therapy plan filled the days. Gentle stretches, water exercises, light pressure tests. At first, Liam cried when pain returned to places that had long been numb. But Grace stayed beside him, whispering, "Pain means your body remembers how to feel." Richard watched quietly, often from the doorway. He had learned that presence mattered more than words. He didn't bark instructions or hide behind calls anymore. He sat through every session, hands folded, expression unreadable, but eyes always on his son. It wasn't easy. Some days Liam refused therapy, burying his face in the pillow. Other days his muscles trembled from exhaustion. Grace learned to read his silence, not as defiance but fear. One morning, when he burst into tears mid-session, she knelt beside him. "You're allowed to be angry," she whispered. He shook his head. "Can't do it," she smiled gently. "Neither could I once." He looked at her, confused. She took his small hand in hers. "I couldn't wake up after my boy died. My body worked, but my heart didn't. You're stronger than I ever was." Something in her tone made him stop crying. He whispered, "You miss him?" "Every day." "Do you miss me?" Grace froze. Then she smiled softly. "I never stop." From that day, he worked harder. Bit by bit, the house came alive again. The old piano in the sitting room, silent for years, was tuned. Grace began playing soft melodies during therapy, helping Liam move to rhythm. Sometimes Richard joined in, his deep voice humming absent-mindedly along. One evening, Grace caught him at the piano alone. His fingers moved hesitantly over the keys, uncertain, but the tune was familiar, the lullaby she had been playing for Liam. When he noticed her watching, he smiled sheepishly. "He used to love this," he said. Laura, his mother, played it every night. Grace sat beside him quietly. She must have had a gentle heart. "She did," he said softly. "And I lost her the same day I almost lost him. For 2 years I thought they both died." He paused, looking down at his hands. "Then you showed up." Grace didn't speak. Some truths didn't need answers. Liam's improvement accelerated. By the 3rd month, he could sit upright without support. By the 4th, he could hold a spoon. And one golden morning, as the sea breeze drifted in through the balcony doors, he stood, briefly, trembling, but on his own. Grace gasped, dropping the folded towel she'd been holding. Richard froze, then rushed forward instinctively, but stopped when she raised her hand. "Let him," she whispered. Liam wobbled, finding balance, his small feet pressing uncertainly against the floor. His face glowed with both terror and pride. He stood for 5 seconds, then 10. Then he laughed, a pure, bright sound that filled the room. Richard dropped to his knees, tears falling freely. Grace covered her mouth, her chest tight with joy. For that one moment, everything stopped. The machines, the noise, the years of pain. It was just a father, a child, and the woman who had brought light back into their lives. That night, the 3 of them ate dinner together for the first time at the grand table. No nurses, no doctors, no formality. Just family. Liam sat between them, awkwardly but proudly lifting his fork. Richard watched him, his smile unguarded. Grace noticed it. "You should smile more often," she teased. He chuckled. "I forgot how." After dinner, Liam dozed off on the couch. Grace placed a blanket over him. Richard stood quietly behind her and said, "He'll walk again soon." She nodded. "He will." Then he added softly, "And when he does, I'll make sure the world remembers who gave him that chance." Grace turned, meeting his eyes. "Please don't. I don't need the world to remember me. I just need him to live." There was silence, the kind that carried gratitude instead of grief. Outside, the sky was filled with stars. Inside, the house no longer echoed with emptiness. It breathed. The walls that once held sorrow now held warmth. And for the first time since tragedy struck, laughter slept inside the Hayes estate again. By the time autumn arrived, the city was ready for judgment. Every major news channel carried the same banner. The Langford case, the boy who moved again. It wasn't just another lawsuit. It had become a moral reckoning. Inside the courthouse, cameras flashed like lightning. Journalists whispered, lawyers adjusted papers, and spectators filled every bench. At the center of it all sat Dr. Marcus Langford, once a celebrated neurologist, now a man stripped of confidence. His expensive suit couldn't hide the sweat on his forehead. Across from him sat Richard Hayes, calm but hollow-eyed, wearing the same black suit he had worn the day his wife's casket was lowered into the ground. Beside him sat Grace Miller, silent, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. And behind them, Dr. Isabel Carter organized files with quiet precision, proof of the lie that had stolen 2 years of a child's life. When the proceedings began, the judge's gavel cut through the murmurs. Court is now in session. The prosecution started with facts, medical reports, dosage charts, recovery timelines. They spoke of ethics, negligence, suppression of progress. But it was Grace's testimony that made the room hold its breath. When her name was called, she rose slowly, walked to the stand, and swore the oath. Her voice trembled at first, but steadied as she spoke. "I wasn't a doctor," she said softly. "I wasn't trained to see miracles. I was just a maid who refused to stop looking. The jury watched her. I saw a boy who everyone called hopeless, she continued. But I saw life in him, small movements, small changes, things the doctors ignored. I don't know medicine, but I know what love looks like when it's trying to survive. Her words silenced even the reporters. Langford's defense lawyer tried to interrupt. Miss Miller, are you suggesting the entire medical community was wrong and you, a domestic worker, knew better? Grace didn't flinch. I'm not suggesting, she said firmly. I'm saying it, the audience gasped softly. The lawyer froze, caught off guard by her calm certainty. Richard watched her with pride and pain both. She was speaking not just for his son, but for every parent who had ever been told to stop believing. When it was Richard's turn to testify, the court fell into another kind of silence, one that came not from shock, but respect. I trusted the wrong man, he said, his voice low. I thought paying more meant caring more. I thought wealth could replace faith. But it took a woman who had lost her own child to teach me how to fight for mine again. He turned toward Langford. You told me there was no hope. You looked me in the eye and told me my son would never move again. And then you gave him medicine that made sure you'd never be proven wrong. Langford said nothing. His hands shook. When Dr. Isabel Carter presented her findings, the evidence spoke louder than any testimony. Video footage of Liam's nightly movements. Medical logs showing deliberate overdosage. Internal memos leaked by the former assistant. By the time she was done, there was no doubt left in the room. The verdict came swiftly. Guilty on all counts. License permanently revoked. Prison sentence, 12 years. But for Richard and Grace, justice wasn't about punishment. It was about peace. After the verdict, as reporters surrounded them, Richard shielded Grace with his arm. Microphones filled the air. Mr. Hayes, do you have a statement? He nodded once. My only statement is this. Sometimes the people the world ignores are the ones who save it. The cameras turned to Grace. She shook her head gently. I'm not a hero, she said. I'm just someone who believed what I saw. Outside the courthouse, the air smelled of rain. The crowd cheered as they exited, but for Grace and Richard, the noise faded behind them. They walked side by side to the car where Liam waited in the back seat, wrapped in a blanket. He looked up with a sleepy smile. We're done? Richard smiled softly. Yes, buddy, we're done. As the car pulled away, the city lights blurred behind raindrops on glass. Grace looked out the window, her reflection fading into the skyline. Justice had been loud. Healing would stay quiet. That night, the house was peaceful. No cameras, no reporters, no visitors. Just wind whispering through the open balcony and a father reading softly to his son. When Liam finally fell asleep, Grace stood by the doorway, watching them both. A picture of the life she had once thought impossible. For the first time in years, she whispered a prayer not for strength but for gratitude, because sometimes miracles don't come from light breaking through clouds. Sometimes they come from people who simply refuse to stop believing in what they see. Winter faded gently that year. The air around the Hayes estate no longer carried sorrow. It carried laughter. Liam's therapy had become part of life now. The morning started with music, not machines. Sunlight filled the corridors instead of sterile shadows. Grace hummed as she adjusted the cushions on the floor while Richard set up a new harness for balance training. 6-year-old Liam sat on the rug, smiling wide, his small legs stretching further than anyone had once imagined possible. Ready? Dr. Carter asked softly. He nodded, determination lighting his face. They had been building to this moment for months. Each day had been a battle of pain, of patience, of faith. But this morning felt different. The boy who once lay in silence now radiated life. His father stood behind him, hands ready to catch. Grace knelt in front, her eyes glistening with quiet pride. All right, Liam, Dr. Carter said gently. When you feel ready, stand. The room went still. Liam's small hands pressed into the floor. His arms trembled. For a moment, nothing happened. Then his knees straightened and his body began to rise. Grace covered her mouth, holding back a cry. Richard whispered, "Come on, son." Liam's body wobbled, his jaw clenched. And then he was upright, standing, 6 years old. 2 years stolen, and yet here he was, balanced on shaky legs, staring into the faces that had refused to give up on him. Grace couldn't stop crying. Richard stepped forward instinctively, afraid the moment would vanish, but Liam shook his head slightly. "No, Dad, I got it." The words broke something open inside everyone in the room. He took one small step, then another. Slow, trembling, but real. Grace sobbed openly now, her hands trembling as she whispered, "You did it, sweetheart." Richard's vision blurred. He dropped to one knee, tears falling freely, arms open. Liam took one last unsteady step into his father's arms. The man who once ruled boardrooms now held the only thing that mattered. Dr. Carter quietly turned away, giving them their moment. Grace knelt beside them, one hand resting gently on Liam's back. Richard whispered into his son's hair, "You're my miracle." Liam smiled. Grace helped. Richard looked at her. Their eyes met. 1,000 words exchanged without speech. Gratitude, love, recognition. That night, the mansion glowed with warmth. Every lamp was lit, every hallway bright. Dinner was a celebration. Liam sat at the head of the table, crown of paper on his head, smiling proudly as Grace served cake. "You're the king tonight," she teased. "I walked," he said proudly, his voice soft but sure. "Yes, you did," she whispered, wiping her eyes. Richard lifted his glass. "To the people who saved my son," he said, looking at Grace and Dr. Carter. "And to the little boy who reminded us that faith is louder than science." They toasted softly, laughter filling the room. After dinner, Liam fell asleep on the couch, clutching a toy car in one hand. Richard draped a blanket over him. Grace stood at the window, gazing at the night sky. "It's strange," she said softly. "When I first came here, this house felt haunted." "It was," Richard said quietly. "By my silence, by what I refused to see," she turned to him. "And now? Now it's alive again. Because of you," she smiled faintly. Because of him. For a long moment they stood in silence, the soft rhythm of the ocean outside carrying through the glass. Later, as Grace prepared to leave for the night, Richard stopped her near the door. "You could stay, you know," he said softly. "You're family now." Grace hesitated, eyes glistening. "I think I'll always be here, one way or another." He nodded, understanding. She stepped outside, the cold air brushing her face, and looked up at the stars. Somewhere her lost son felt close. For the first time in years, she didn't ache, she felt peace. Inside, Richard stood over Liam's sleeping form. The boy shifted slightly, murmuring something in his sleep. "Mommy." Richard froze. He turned to Grace, who had paused in the doorway, tears welling. Liam's voice was soft but clear. "Mommy, look, I walked." Grace's breath caught. She pressed a trembling hand to her mouth. Richard smiled, voice barely above a whisper. "He's talking to her," he said. "To Laura, maybe. Maybe she saw." Grace nodded, tears sliding down her cheeks. "I think she did." The room went quiet again, but not the old kind of silence. This one was alive, full of peace and memory. Outside, the waves glimmered under moonlight. Inside, a boy who had once been trapped in stillness dreamed of running. Finally, we've reached the end of this story. A father who lost everything found faith again. A woman who carried grief turned it into courage. And a child who was once paralyzed by lies learned to walk again through love. Thank you for watching till the end. Tell us in the comments what part of this story touched you the most. And don't forget to subscribe, because more stories like this, filled with truth, emotion, and hope, are coming soon. Until next time.